welcome to Tea with Tolkien, an online community for the Hobbit at heart. We are inspired by the works, life, and Catholic faith of J.R.R. Tolkien and strive to encourage others towards a deeper love and understanding of Tolkien's legendarium by hosting a free book club, providing free resources, and by cultivating a vibrant and positive community online. Our book club is currently wrapping up our discussion of The Fall of Númenor, edited by Brian Sibley. If you would like to join in on future discussions, you can sign up for our free book club at teawithtolkien.com/book-club to receive the link to our Discord server. For the sake of this book club, I have broken The Fall of Númenor down into 10 sections, so today we are covering the 8th section, which spans years 3261 to 3319, or pages 173 to 193 in the book. The Downfall of Númenor. This is a sad section, but it's quite exciting, quite important. Almost all of this section comes directly from a Calabaith, which is published within the Silmarillion. So if you have already read the Silmarillion, a lot of this is going to be just a refresher, really. And if you haven't read the Silmarillion, then you are in for a treat. 3261. Our Pharazôn sets sail and lands at Umbar. So Sauron had begun to bait the Númenorian king's wrath by assailing areas of Middle-earth under their dominion, and he also gave himself the title King of Men, which enraged Pharazôn, who in his pride had determined that he himself should claim the title. Now, of course, Sauron knows this, and he is scheming, as always, to bring about the downfall of Númenor. Pharazôn prepares to go to war against Sauron and sailed to Umbar. When they arrived, Pharazôn and his men marched for 7 days deeper into Middle-earth, where they commanded Sauron to come before him and swear fealty. In this time, Sauron surrendered and humbled himself before Pharazôn, and Pharazôn brought Sauron back to Númenor as a hostage. 3262. Sauron is taken as a prisoner to Númenor. 3262 through 3310. Sauron seduces the king and corrupts the Númenorians. Now Sauron went gladly to Númenor, bringing with him his envy and hatred of the Númenorians. He acted like, oh no, don't make me go, this is terrible, I'm so sad to humble myself before you, but this is obviously all a sham, and he was quite happy to be brought to the very place he wanted to destroy. He thought he could destroy it from within, and we all know he was right. There he continued to scheme for the downfall of Númenor from within the island itself. He soon became the closest of the king's advisors, and he contradicted and undermined all the teachings of the Valar and the Eldar, and the earliest kings of Númenor who had remained faithful. Sauron taught the men of Númenor that there were many lands which may be conquered, and that even beyond that there lay an ancient darkness. He told Pharazôn that Melkor was the lord of the darkness, and that the Valar had been deceiving them in teaching of Eru, and that Melkor alone would give them freedom from these lies. In this time, Pharazôn turned to worship of the dark, and he did this in secret at first, but then later openly. Amandil was the chief of the faithful, and he dwelt in Rhomenna with his son Elendil. Amandil had been close with the king, and he remained in his council until the coming of Sauron. Sauron urged Pharazôn to cut down the white tree, Nimloth the Fair, though he hesitated at first. And when Isildur, son of Elendil, found out about this, he went on a harrowing journey to rescue a fruit which hung upon the branches of Nimloth. He nearly died in doing so, and this was a super, super valiant act, and we all know after reading this that Isildur is actually a pretty cool character. He doesn't deserve the hate he gets from the Lord of the Rings, but that's just an aside. After this, the king yielded to Sauron, and Nimloth was ultimately cut down. Sauron commissioned a temple to be built in Armenelos where sacrifices would be burnt for Melkor, and the first sacrifice to be burnt was the wood of Nimloth. From this time on, human sacrifices began in Númenor. Death, sickness, and madness flourished throughout Númenor, and all-around societal and cultural decline occurs in this time. Now, despite this, the Númenorians felt that they prospered. Under Sauron's direction, they became more powerful and ever more wretched. Yet they still perceived that they were doing great, which I think is quite silly. The Númenorians began to hunt and enslave the men of Middle-earth, and Tolkien writes, "Thus our Pharazôn, king of the land of the star, grew to the mightiest tyrant that had yet been seen in the world since the reign of Morgoth, though in truth Sauron ruled all from behind the throne." As Ar-Pharazôn's life waned and he was faced evermore with his own mortality, Sauron saw that the time was right to offer him one final temptation. He suggested that he should claim the undying life and the lands of the Valar. 33:10. Ar-Pharazôn begins building the great armament. In this time, Pharazôn prepared to assail the Valar. Amandil was filled with dread, and he formed a plan in which he might plead before the Valar in the same manner as Eärendil. Amandil then departed in secret to sail towards Valinor, charging Elendil to ready his ships and prepare for a flight from Númenor. In 33:19, Ar-Pharazôn assails Valinor. Downfall of Númenor, Elendil and his sons escape. The Númenorians prepared to make their assault upon Valinor. In this time, the eagles of the Lords of the West came as a warning, along with the great storms and lightning. Pharazôn hardened his heart along with most of the Númenorians. When lightning smote the temple of Melkor, Sauron was unharmed by the lightning, and the Númenorians took this as a sign that he was a god. The Númenorians prepared the fleets of Númenor, and they readied themselves for battle against the Valar. Sauron withdrew into the temple, where he continued to make human sacrifices to Melkor, and he's feeling quite smug at this point. Ar-Pharazôn led the fleets of the Númenorians to Aman, where he stepped foot on the shores of the Blessed Realm. But this is not before he momentarily wavered, and that's something I want to talk about in a little bit. In this time, the Valar relinquished their dominion of Arda temporarily, and Ilúvatar stepped in. All the fleets of Númenor were swallowed up into the abyss. All who had set foot upon the shores of Aman were buried under falling hills. Lands were destroyed, new lands were formed, and the geography of Arda was completely changed forever. The Blessed Realm and Eressëa were removed, and Númenor was swallowed up into the sea. Elendil and his sons were saved, for they had stayed in Ramenna, and then came to Middle-earth, which we'll talk about next week. Sauron fell, however, as he laughed into the abyss. Now he was not mortal, and he couldn't die, but he was unable to return to his physical form after this. His spirit remained and fled back to Mordor, taking up his great ring. It is said that the summit of the Meneltarma, the Pillar of Heaven, remained as an island, and after the downfall of Númenor, the world was made round, whereas it had been flat before. So quite a lot happens in this chapter. This week we had a really fun discussion, and while I don't think I have time to get into everything that we talked about, I do want to bring up a couple of points. So one of the biggest elements that I'm really drawn to in this section is Pharazôn's near repentance. So Tolkien talks about this moment where doom hung by a thread because Pharazôn wavered. And maybe, I'm sure it's out of fear, but I'm sure it's also out of his own conscience speaking to him. And that's something that's really important in Tolkien's stories. You see that with Sméagol, where he has this moment of almost repentance. We have that with Sauron, where he briefly at the beginning of the Second Age considers repentance, but then ultimately makes his own choice. And I think that I really love that Tolkien wrote this into the story, because you can see that while he is being influenced by Sauron, this is his own choice. It's not as if he's a puppet for Sauron. He's making this of his own free will, even though his own free will has been distorted and twisted, and he's kind of living under a shadow. So I really love that Tolkien added this. I think it also highlights the destruction of pride, the way that pride erodes your own conscience. Pharazôn would have turned back, but it was because of his pride. He's like, I've already gotten this far. I've led all of these men down this path. I'm going to see it through. And I also think something else that might be at play that I think is something very Tolkienian is this sense of despair that can come from feeling like you're beyond hope. So there's a lot of complex emotions happening at this time, and it's stuff like this that I really love and I really enjoy from Tolkien. So I wanted to point it out for anyone who might have missed it, because like he does a lot of times, he mentions things very briefly, but the more you kind of sit with it, the more you're like, oh wow, this is pretty intense. We also discussed the question of where is the ring, because this is something there's kind of conflicting evidence for. There are some places where we kind of assume that Sauron has the ring with him, but then there's also evidence for assuming that he had left the ring behind. So the question of where is the ring? Did he just leave it in a little box in Middle Earth? Who's watching the ring? And this is kind of one of those things where it's up to your interpretation, but it was kind of a fun discussion. But it also highlighted the fact that while he put his power into the ring, as long as nobody else had it, it wouldn't really be a big deal for him. So just something to kind of mull over and think about. We also highlighted that the timeline of the downfall itself. We also talked about Sauron's perception of the Valar. He seems to be under the impression that he could do whatever he wanted with Númenor and that they wouldn't really step in at all. So there was almost a question of, do we think he was surprised by what happened? Do we think he really believed he was going to get away with it? Or do we think he knew ultimately that this could happen? And we kind of wondered what his motivations were, what his expectations were. Like, did he think that the island itself would actually be swallowed up into the sea? Because I think that's unlikely, since he was physically dwelling on the island. He probably would have left the island if he would have foreseen that fate. Did he think that shortened lifespan, violent crime, madness, sickness, and, the general destruction of Númenor would, in terms of a society, would be enough? We also highlighted his laughter as he's falling. Like, what does Tolkien mean by this? Is he laughing in a sense of hubris where he thinks he's kind of gotten away with everything? Or is he laughing at like the absurdity of it all? That was another thing that was highlighted in our discussion. Do we think Sauron achieved his goal? Because we know that his goal was to destroy Númenor, but did it cost him more than he intended? Was he planning to lose the ability to take a fair form? Because obviously I think his fair form worked out very well for him. He was able to get a lot done with it. And so having lost that seems like a great cost. But yeah, there was a lot of devastation that happened in this section, and it was really quite sad. I think in the audiobook version of this, I know I've been listening to the audiobook, and I just wanted to mention it. The narration of this section in particular was really moving. When the narrator is reading the part about the great loss of Númenor, every little bit, every person, every item, every bit of lore is all being lost. It was very moving, and I highly recommend the audiobook if you enjoy audiobooks. So that should wrap us up for this week. Next week, we are going to be covering part 9 of The Fall of Númenor, which covers the last alliance and basically the end of the Second Age. So thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate everyone who has participated in our book club so far. We have such a great community, and I'm really grateful for all of you. So I will see you all soon with part 9.